Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli wa nusallimu ala rasulihil kareem. Ma ba'd, and welcome to another video on the Islamic Knowledge YouTube channel. And before we go any further, if I can encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and consider sharing this video with others who may also benefit as well. And before we go any further, I also want to speak to you about our latest course that is going to start this coming December on Islamic history. In one full year, so it will be a 1-year study of Islamic history, and we will be discussing the great empires of the past, and we'll be doing it in an organized and accessible manner such that if you're a beginner or even an intermediate level student in Islamic history, you will enjoy this 1-year course and you will really benefit from it. So if you're interested, the registration link is in the description below. Please do register and come and join us on this adventure, on this course. Now, today's book, although written by someone not really from the Islamic tradition, it is a book that should be read, I believe, by every student of Islamic knowledge. The title is The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, and it's written by Peter Frankopan. And we've got a comment here by the brilliant historian William Dalrymple, who says, "Brilliant and fearless. This is history on a grand scale." Now, why is this book so important? Now, I read this book about 4 years ago, and it actually made me realize that the history I have been taught in school, it is actually completely inaccurate, and it creates the wrong picture of history. And it was actually only a small part of history that I was actually taught in school. And the author is showing that our study of history is very Eurocentric, i.e. we think that Europe was the center stage of history, whereas in reality, the vast majority of history actually took place in a completely different area, and Europe was in a place of complete darkness for most of history except around 1500s. So this book highlights the history of the world, showing how Asia and sort of the Middle Eastern area and basically everything besides Central Europe is where the vast majority of the interesting aspects of history took place. It also shows how all the great players of history were not really interested in Europe that much. They were more interested in Baghdad, in Persia, in Central Asia, in India, Jerusalem, Egypt, etc. Now, another thing this book really does quite well, as the name suggests, is that it's trying to show how the globalized world that we're currently living in, where events on one side of the world impact the events on another side of the world, that's not entirely new. In fact, there were these silk roads that connected different parts of the world right from the earliest stages of history. So if we look at the contents page of the actual book, we've got every single chapter has got the word road inside of it. So we've got the road of faiths, the road to a Christian East, the road to revolution, the road to concord, the road of furs, the slave road, the road to heaven, the road to hell, the road of death and destruction. And each one is talking about a certain event that took place in one part of the world and how that kind of traveled along the Silk Roads and affected events at another juncture of the world. Now, I have got some notes that I wrote on this book when I read it about 4 or 5 years ago, and I do intend to share this on the Islamic Knowledge Telegram channel. So if you just pop onto Telegram, and as you can see in the center of the screen, just type in @IK Courses, you'll see a channel that pops up. Subscribe, join that channel, and you'll get my notes, which I've actually even typed out now. So this is a really, really interesting book. And by the way, this is not exactly a fun read. It's not entirely a fun read, but it's not really a boring read either. It's somewhere in between, and some parts actually will make you laugh out loud, but there's nothing facetious or sarcastic inside this book. But the language is actually super easy, and it can be understood by pretty much anyone, even someone who is a novice to history. Now, the book is pretty big. You've got about 521 pages of pure reading, we could say. And if we look at the references, they themselves are over 100 sides. So you've got the references that start from about here, page 523-ish, and it goes on all the way until page 600 or so, just over 600. And you can see that the author has done a lot of research in writing this book. He's utilized a lot of academic books, so you can see the books that he's used in here as well, and a lot of academic journals as well. And that's really something that's quite interesting about this book. So let's look at some of the interesting points in this book. For example, just to kind of lay home the idea that no one was really interested in Europe in the early period of history until about 1500s, he speaks here about Alexander the Great. He says, "None was a keener student of such works than Alexander of Macedon. When he took the throne in 336 BC following the assassination of his father, the brilliant King Philip, there was no question about which direction the young general would head in his search for glory. Not for a moment did he look to Europe, which offered nothing at all, no cities, no culture, no prestige, no reward. For Alexander, as for all ancient Greeks, culture, ideas and opportunities, as well as threats, came from the East. It was no surprise that his gaze fell on the greatest power of antiquity, Persia." Then on page 14, he shows how Rome actually only became a proper empire when it conquered Egypt. So he says Rome had long cast a greedy eye over Egypt. It seized its chance when Queen Cleopatra became embroiled in a messy struggle for political mastery after the assassination of Julius Caesar. After faithfully throwing in her lot with Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium in 30 BC, the Egyptian ruler was soon faced with a Roman army led by Octavian, a master of political cunning, bearing down on Alexandria. Following a series of defensive decisions that combined profound negligence with gross incompetence, Cleopatra committed suicide, either as the result of a poisonous snake bite or perhaps by a self-administered toxin. Egypt fell like a ripe fruit. Octavian had left Rome as a general. This is important. So he left Rome as a general, but he returned as its supreme ruler with a new title shortly to be bestowed by a grateful Senate, Augustus. Rome had become an empire. So it's after conquering Egypt that he actually becomes, not by conquering Europe, but actually by conquering a country that's, you could say, out of Europe, and it's part of Africa, to be honest. That is when Rome sort of becomes an empire, according to this book. Then on page 25, something that our Indian followers will find quite interesting, that the city or the town we have that we call Bharuch. So he says, we can imagine the life of a gold coin 2 millennia ago, struck perhaps in a provincial mint and used by a young soldier as part of his pay to buy goods on the northern frontier in England, and finding its way back into Rome in the coffers of an imperial officer sent to collect taxes, before passing into the hands of a trader heading east, heading towards India, and then being used to pay for produce brought from traders who had come to sell their provisions at Barigaza. And that is actually what we refer to in India as Bharuch. So I thought that was quite interesting. On pages 83, 85 and 87, the author discusses how the message of the Prophet sallallahu, alayhi wasallam was actually one of conciliation. He says here, Muhammad's message was one of conciliation. Believers who follow the Jewish faith or are Christians who live good lives have nothing to fear or regret, says the Quran on more than one occasion. He says on page 85, he says the emphasis on treating Jews and Christians alike with respect and tolerance is unmistakable, i.e. in his study of Islam. On page 87, he says cohabitation of the faiths was an important hallmark of early Islamic expansion and an important part of its success. The fact that Islam was actually quite tolerant of different religions is actually what helped it to grow quite a bit. On page 200, we have an incredibly important section where the author discusses how Christopher Columbus's voyage was actually a form of a crusade, and he thought he was going to meet the Mongol king to raise an army to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims. And this I thought was absolutely mind-blowing when I read this. One example of a man who fretted over the future of the faith was Christopher Colon. Although by his own calculations there were still 155 years to go before the second coming, Colon was outraged that little more than lip service was being paid to matters of religion by the faithful, and was particularly appalled by Europe's lack of concern for Jerusalem. With a fervour bordering on obsession, he drew up plans to launch a new campaign to liberate the holy city, while at the same time developing a second fixation about the precious metals, spices and gems that were so abundant and cheap in Asia. If only it were possible to get better access to them, he concluded, they could in turn easily fund a major expedition to liberate Jerusalem. The problem was that being based in the Iberian Peninsula placed him at the wrong end of the Mediterranean and made his grand idea little more than a pipe dream. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope. There were, after all, the voices of astrologers and cartographers like Paolo Toscanelli in Florence, who had argued that a route to Asia could be found by sailing west from the edge of Europe. After a titanic struggle to convince others that to share a vision which bordered on the reckless and foolhardy, Christopher Colon's scheme finally started to become concrete. Letters of greeting were prepared for the great Khan with a blank space, so they don't even know his name, with a blank space to be filled in once his exact name was ascertained. He was to be an ally in the recovery of Jerusalem. Interpreters were required so that it would be possible to converse with the Mongol leader and his representatives. Specialists were hired who knew Hebrew, and he carries on, and later on he explains, little did Colon, more familiar as Christopher Columbus, realize that he was about to do something remarkable. He was about to shift Europe's center of gravity from east to west. So this is where he speaks about Christopher Columbus's discovery. And then on page 238, the author discusses how the discovery of the Americas, which Christopher Columbus thought was actually India, helped give Europe tremendous amount of money, and it allowed them to purchase goods from the real India in the East. So the author writes something that's quite interesting. He says on page 238, he says, not without irony, one of the glories of India was the result of the suffering of Indians on the other side of the world. So India prospered, the real India, whilst the fake Indians, so to speak, the Native Americans, they are the ones who had to suffer so that Europe can get rich and use it to pay for loads of material and metals and spices that they were going to acquire from India. He also discusses on page 260 something quite interesting, to be honest. He says a lot of the European inventions that we have during the Renaissance period were actually all connected to violence, and they were all to do with developing artillery and equipment that would be used for violence. He says the great irony then was that although Europe experienced a glorious golden age producing flourishing art and literature and leaps of scientific endeavor, it was forged by violence. He actually even says here on this same page, it was not for nothing that World War and the worst genocide in history had their origins and execution in Europe. These were the latest chapters in a long-running story of brutality and violence. So completely different to what we're told in school, so to speak. Then on page 265, he explains how even in the late 1500s, 1600s, a Muslim woman would probably be treated better, even in terms of inheritance, than how her European counterpart would be treated. So it says a Muslim woman could expect to be much better looked after than her European peer. It says here, this in turn meant that the gap between rich and poor was never as acute as it became in Europe because money was redistributed and recirculated more widely. Then on page 391 and 392, we have some of the most mind-blowing details. I was almost screaming when I read this. We have a discussion here of how Hitler had been championing the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine for 2 decades. Also, that the Jews offered to help the Nazis and were considering collaborating with them in World War II, and essentially collaborating with the greatest anti-Semite of all time as long as he helped them secure Palestine. So they were going to fight for the Germans as long as at the end of the war you give us Palestine. So he writes, and this part is absolutely, it's just shocking and it's mind-blowing. He says there had been discussions in Nazi Germany about deporting Jews elsewhere too. In fact, and perversely, Hitler had been championing the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine for the best part of 2 decades. In the spring of 1938, he spoke in support of a policy of emigration of German Jews to the Middle East and the formation of a new state to be their home. He actually carries on and he discusses how you got the Stern gang that actually wanted to help the Nazis. So here he says this was bluster. In fact, Stern was being pragmatic, even though the hopes he placed in allying with Germany was not shared by all within his own organization. All we want of the Germans, he said shortly afterwards to explain his stance, is to bring Jewish recruits to Palestine. In doing so, the war against the British to liberate the homeland will begin here. The Jews will attain a state and the Germans will incidentally be rid of an important British base in the Middle East and also solve the Jewish question in Europe. This is the Jews saying this. It seemed logical and horrific. Leading Jewish figures were actively proposing collaboration with the greatest anti-Semite of all time, negotiating with the perpetrators of the Holocaust hardly 12 months before the genocide began. They were already speaking to Hitler or trying to convince him to allow him to give them Palestine, and in return they would more or less fight for him. Then later on page 473, when the author is discussing the Iran and Iraq war, the author mentions how Israel actually helped Iran in the war in this regard. So he says Iran was also supplied in large volume by Israel, which took the view that Saddam Hussein had to be stopped at all costs. The willingness of the Iranians and the Israelis to do business with each other was in many ways surprising, especially given the derogatory way that Khomeini in particular regularly talked about Jews and about Israel. So you can see Iran and Israel were now cast as unlikely bedfellows thanks to Saddam Hussein's intervention in the Gulf. And the latter parts of the book just show how the imperialistic nature of Britain and then US, especially when it comes to oil, wherein the two were having a proxy war with the Soviet Union, really led to quite terrible consequences. And he kind of blows the lid on a bit of the hypocrisy of the West and how they were more or less obsessed with oil. In fact, there's a part in the book on page 409 about how the US were completely ignorant towards Saudi. They had no interest in Saudi until oil was discovered. So this is quite interesting. So he says here, likewise, the following year, Saudi Arabia was dismissed by the US as a country of limited consequence, whose request for economic help could be easily swatted away by President Roosevelt as being a little far afield for us. Roosevelt added that it would be better for Saudi concerns and requests to be directed to Britain than to the US. By the time the war ended, things were very different, with Saudi Arabia alone being considered to be more important to American diplomacy than almost any other small nation. The reason for this was oil. So all in all, an absolutely amazing book that I thoroughly enjoyed. I read it a while back, but sort of reread certain chapters just for this video, and just because of how incredible the book is. I'd highly recommend this book. And if this sort of thing interests you, then please do consider registering for our history course on Islamic history. But we will be kind of touching on interesting topics that perhaps not the end of this book will cover, but a lot of the stuff that came in between this book, we will cover it in our history course. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and jazakumullahu khairan wa ahsan jaza for watching it. I hope you share it with others, and inshallah until the next video, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.